Okay.
are the Mandalorians the Klingons of Star Wars? And this is kind of an ambiguous statement,
Right.
because what does it mean to be the Klingons of something?
Right.
Um, but like basically, it's a kind of alien who are central to the story, but
Mm-hmm.
have just completely fucking wildly divergent portrayals over the
Hmm.
years is one big thing. And
Right.
like there's like a heavy like weird race element to a lot of what happens with the Klingons.
Right.
And that doesn't show up quite as much with the Mandalorians. There are some questions along the way,
Right.
but like we're not going to talk about the Klingons in Discovery, because that's not what I meant by this, because that was a bad direction. But
Yeah.
if you see the Klingons in the original series, they're just like these dudes that I think are like in brown face or something. It's kind of what's going on there. I think they're just painted up to look like an alien color, but it kind of reads now as like okay, but they just don't look super alien. They don't have the ridges and things, right? Because
Right.
when you think of Klingons, you think of Worf, you think of Michael Dorn, that whole thing, right?
Right.
They didn't have the prosthetic makeup back then.
Right.
So for the next generation, they came up with prosthetic makeup and all of that, and then someone in the production staff. This is probably well documented and well known. Who knows who? But someone was like, "How do we reconcile the fact that the Klingons look different now than they
Hmm.
used to?" Don't do that. Because when I was talking earlier about the whole like Ricardo Montalban goes in, Benedict Cumberbatch goes out,
Right.
Star Trek tries to do that. Like they try to reconcile things and come up with it. And there's just this whole deal that like somebody like asks Worf about it,
Hmm.
and he's like, we don't talk about that. So there's like some weird, and like they maybe actually get into it and explain what it was, but there was like some weird genetic weapon that was fired on them or something. Like they went under some wacky, like massive physical change as an entire species, and it was like this collective trauma that
Right.
they underwent. And it was like, you were doing too much. You never had to, you just be like, it's different shows. Like, it's okay.
Yeah.
You don't have to do this. So the whole thing is like, you see Boba Fett, and he's just a dude in a helmet.
Right.
And like, this is what I'm saying about Star Wars being so messy. They never have plans. So I mean, I don't know. Maybe George Lucas had like this much on like what a Mandalorian was back then.
Hmm.
Nobody knows. But he's the only one that you see in the
Right.
original trilogy. And then like the extended universe kind of talks a little bit more about it. And it always kind of felt to me like it was a little bit of like Last of the Mohicans or something, where he's like the only one that's kind of around. Because I've read a bunch of Boba Fett stuff, but it was when I was like 14, so I don't know.
Right.
I don't remember anymore. But he never really interacts with other ones. And so I don't know when and where the whole like Jango Fett thing first came into being.
Right.
I guess it was in the prequel movies. So my understanding of Jango Fett,
Hmm.
well, I guess our whole understanding of Boba Fett now is that he's a clone.
Right.
He's not like a natural biological son of Jango Fett. He's a clone.
Right.
And it's Tamura Morrison who played Jango Fett.
Yeah.
So okay, and so I've never really thought too hard about this in the intervening years. But so all the clone troopers are based on Jango Fett's genetic material.
Right.
And so that in and of itself is a big problem for the rest of the Mandalorians.
Here's the
Is it
thing,
is
though.
Boba Fett okay, is Boba Fett's nature as a clone the reason why they're like you're not a real Mandalorian, or is it because of like him and his dad?
It's Django. So basically, the
Okay.
what's implied in the series, because they briefly talk about it, just because like it was a sort of a fallout thing from Attack of the Clones, was that it's implied that Django stole a dead Mandalorian's armor,
That he's not actually
that
Mandalorian?
he's not actually Mandalorian, and that is a very big no-no on Mandalorian culture because armor is
Well,
basically an extension of self. So
right, it's cultural appropriation, honey.
yeah.
So you're telling me that like is this like sussed out? Like there's an accusation, but is it ever like treated as like this is what we know happened?
Yeah, they never really get into it. It's just mentioned, like, I think it comes up in the first episode. Satine shows up. She says something about like, oh, like she basically says like, yeah, he's not an actual Mandalorian. He stole someone's armor.
So okay, so this whole question that we've been having for a long time
Hmm.
about like are Mandalorians an ethnicity, like a racial group, or are they just like a religious
Hmm.
group that may or may not be tied to a particular race is still up in the air entirely.
Right.
Okay,
Because
because that was the whole thing. Because that's the whole thing with Tamura Morrison. Because it works in two different ways. Because the
mhm,
first question is, does that mean that typically speaking, Mandalorians are Maori? Because that was one of the questions about um, God, what is his about the Mandalorian, right? And
right,
like Pedro Pascal, right? And then of course you find out that he's an orphan who was adopted into the Mandalorian, so it doesn't answer either question.
right,
And Tamura Morrison doesn't answer that question either,
right,
right? Um, so you just kind of don't really know
right,
because like Boba Fett in the intervening years has been played like in the prequels. He was played by a Maori actor, and then Tamura Morrison was dubbed back into the original trilogy
right,
to play Boba Fett as well.
right.
So like for those two characters, that's what that is. But it doesn't. So they're kind of. So I guess we don't know if they're the Klingons
Yeah, and
of
like,
Star Wars at all in the category in the sense that I didn't really want to get too far into with
yeah,
them. But here's the other question that I don't understand that we just I don't know if we'll ever really know for sure. But that also means that like all of the clone troopers, like that they were based on him,
hmm,
that they're whatever the Star Wars version of Maori is, I guess. Um, but I guess there's a point because especially I guess once you get to like um God, what is his name? Traitor John Boyega,
yeah,
right?
Finn, yeah,
So there's kind of, and maybe this is answered somewhere in the films because because it has been the extended thing and we don't know what their standing is. But like at some point, all of the clone troopers were clones of Jango Fett, and they were through the Clone Wars.
yeah,
But are the stormtroopers well I guess Solo starts to answer this question but doesn't, right? Because the implication in Solo is that the stormtroopers and whatnot, the Imperial Army, are a standing army of recruits and conscripts because he's part of like a ground force unit
right,
in Solo. I always forget that Solo actually starts to answer this question because it always fucks me up because in the extended universe he joined the Navy. He was a pilot, which makes sense, right?
right.
And in Solo, I was like, what? What are they doing in a trench? What the fuck? Because I knew they weren't like I know it's a new thing, but I was still kind of like, oh, you're
Yeah.
even throwing that out?
But yeah, so this is actually brought up in Rebels, was that after the Clone Wars, the Empire basically jettisoned the entire cloning Camino project,
Yeah.
and that basically all of the stormtroopers are conscripts, and
Okay.
it gets brought up because Rex specifically kind of talks about it and talks about how like cheap stormtrooper armor is compared to the clone armor.
Right.
So yeah, it is so it is
Which is kind of
canon.
ironic, but
Right.
you think you'd, but that's the Empire for you, actually. That's
Yeah.
the Empire for you. Yeah.
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 So
Yeah, because TIE fighters don't have shields, of course, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they
See,
so
this
it's
is what I mean by I know a shitload about Star Wars.
right.
I always remember the TIE fighters on unshielded craft.
Right.
Because the anxiety of flying an unshielded craft, even in a flight simulator video game, when
Yeah.
you have an option to play a shielded one elsewhere, is fucking mind numbing.
Yeah. But yeah, so yeah, the clones were decommissioned after the Clone Wars.
Okay.
So the ones that survived basically just went to the winds.
And those are the three dudes.
Yeah, so the three clones that you see in rebels are Rex, Gregor, and Wolf, which I think Wolf only shows up briefly in Clone Wars. But Rex is sort of your main, is kind of like your main like clone point, I guess, because he's the one who interacts the most with like Ahsoka and everybody else.
So all of the questions about the basic nature of the Mandalorians are still open.
Yeah. So.
Because Sabine Wren
Mhm.
is the only significant Mandalorian that we've seen that was actually born into Mandalorian culture, because
Yes.
Boba Fett is a clone of a
Mhm.
dude who stole some armor,
Right.
allegedly.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. So we just don't know jack shit about them because we've never really seen one. So that the Mandalorian, I guess, that we've really spent the most time with,
Right.
outside of the cartoons, is the armorer.
Yeah. I.
So our like vessel for whatever like Mandalorian culture is kind of her. She's
Yeah.
the highest authority that we have to understand what the fuck the Mandalorians actually are in and of themselves.
Right. Because the Mandalorians we see in Clone Wars, they're mostly just fighting with each other.
Right.
So we do get
But
understanding
we
of
don't
like.
know what the standing of that is going to be in The
Right.
Mandalorian. No one has said to us everything that happened in Clone Wars is what we're building on here.
Right.
Because they could still be very selective in what they're bringing across. Because stuff like Forrest Whitaker's character in Rogue One is pretty faithful, pretty direct. You
Right.
feel like you're watching the ending of something that began elsewhere.
Right.
But we have no promises that be this is going to be that way. Because, like, sure, Dave Filoni's here, but is Dave Filoni completely tied to everything they did with the Mandalorians back then? You know, does John Favreau care that much about Mandalorian continuity in the Clone Wars cartoons? Do the people above them care that much about that? We don't know.
Right.
So it seems to me,
Mhm.
in all of the live action current Star Wars that we have, the closest thing to an authoritative voice we have on what the Mandalorians are as a culture is the armorer.
Yes, at this point.
Fuck. I
Yeah.
really didn't realize how open all this shit was. Because I think maybe you told me the Jango Fett thing before, and I
Right.
forgot. Wow. Okay. What's the